African Development Bank annual meetings in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, on the theme, Making Africa's Capital Work for Africa's Development, which is an important theme for African countries, given that Africa's capital, its human resources, its natural resources do not actually work for Africa's development because of an extractive global economy in which African countries find themselves. You have heard of issues of illicit financial flows, the high cost of borrowing for African countries, which is the highest compared to any other region in the world. Bond yields in African countries attract about 11% interest rate compared to less than 2%, for developed countries like Germany and United States of America. And this is concerning, right? And it makes the theme, for the African Development Bank annual meetings very timely at a time when we are pushing for reforms of the global financial architecture, at a time when we are also pushing for reparative justice, and at a time when we are going for the Financing for Development Conference in Seville, Spain. These are windows of opportunities for African countries to push for a reform of the global financial architecture, because this is key in making Africa's capital also work for Africa's development. And it is also coming at a time when false solutions are being peddled, right? Where we are beginning to see some new creditors emerging, especially the private creditors, who lend to African countries at very high interest rates. And this is part of the problem. Part of the problem, why? Because these interest rates end up, increasing the amount of debt burdens that African countries are carrying, right? And at the end of the day, the financial resources that are supposed to be invested in development are actually being drained through debt service, to international creditors instead of actually delivering on development. And then, when it comes to a situation where countries are faced with heavy debt burdens, as we already have now, they have to go for debt restructuring. And debt restructuring comes with conditionalities. Conditionalities here means countries have to cut on social expenditure. They have to start doing what they call fiscal consolidation, which is a polite word for austerity, which means increased taxation, right? Cuts in civil servant salaries, cut in social service expenditure, for instance, for health, for education, cuts in financial resources that are supposed to go in for infrastructure development that can boost Africa's capital and, of course, advance Africa's development. So we end up in a situation where Africa is rich. It has resources, of course, which is part of its capital, its natural capital, as well as the human capital. We are at a point where this is not delivering on Africa's development. It's not contributing to Africa's development, and makes the theme of the African Development Bank meeting this year quite timely. And just to add, maybe when you're doing this, and just to add that the African Development Bank, of course, has some of its creditors, right, or some of his partners that are non-African countries, mostly members of the Paris Club, G20, OECD countries, some of the multilateral or the bilateral creditors, to African countries, and who work on the same rule, right? They have the same, they play the same role in terms of how they make the global financial system work for African countries, because it is the same system of extractivism that has put African countries in a situation of recurrent indebtedness since the 1970s. And making Africa's capital work for Africa's development means we need to make sure that these creditors, that they work together with African countries to reform the global financial architecture and ensure that the rules are more equitable, that they deliver within the interest or development interest of African countries, and not just on the interest of the creditors.